as it was a form of divination. The art simply involved looking ahead into potential alternate futures, scanning probabilities to determine which form had the greatest possibility of occurring. It took skill, certainly, but not a great deal of effort, especially if the answer only looked a short time into the future. However, anything beyond a few minutes involves scanning so many probability branches that only the most skilled chronomancers could know what might happen days, weeks, or months in advance. Chronourgy was the greater challenge by far, as it involved the actual manipulation of time. All magic defied nature's laws to an extent, even analytic magic, and it required a certain strength of will to perform. Yet wielding the elements and influencing the forces of nature was not. All these things ran through my mind as those ponderous, ground-shaking footsteps drew near. I was only halfway through a full shift when the creature's footsteps came to a halt maybe 30 yards away, in the direction of a large hill topped with a cluster of those strange, shard-like structures. Whatever it was, it had chosen to remain hidden, and I had a distinct sensation that I was being watched. No matter how many times I shifted, it was always agony. It required a complete muscular and skeletal restructuring of my body. Adding several hundred pounds of mass along with several feet in height and girth to my lean 6'1" frame was no walking park. Every single time my skin would split and my muscles would tear away from my bones, reattaching and mending even as they grew denser and more resistant to damage. Pain was excruciating, but I kept my eyes on the hill as I focused on speeding up my transformation. Considering the furtive nature of whatever stalked me, I'd expected to catch just a glimpse of it. Maybe a head popping up from behind a rock, or an eye stalk. So, when a 16-foot tall, black-furred gorilla thing came running out from cover, I nearly shat myself. It was an absolutely terrifying creature. Muscular and hairy like an ape, but with huge dinosaur-like feet and arms that forked at the elbow, resulting in upper appendages that had two muscular forearms and matching clawed hands on each. Yet those features paled in comparison to the absolutely freakish and utterly grotesque appearance of its head and face. For one, its skull was shaped all wrong, almost like it had grown upside down atop its neck. Pink eyes set on short, bony protrusions stared at me from where its ears should, and it lacked a jaw entirely, instead displaying a huge mouth that split its skull cap vertically down the middle. When it opened that orifice to reveal a double row of razor-sharp teeth, I found myself wishing I'd skipped. The thing was coming at me with a speed that contradicted its size, halving the distance between us in 2 short seconds. It could easily reach me while I was still in the midst of my transformation, and while I'd been known to fight in that state, I doubted my chances in doing so against this creature. Thus, I needed to improvise a strategy that would give me enough time to complete my shift. A dozen different spells and tactics ran through my mind in an instant. Druidry was out of the question, since I'd had little time to adjust to the strange eldritch magic of this planet. Besides, Click had obviously left me in this situation to force me to use time limit. And since he was much better at chronomancy, I could only assume that was my best option. A stasis spell would work, but it was hard to cast on a fast-moving target. By the time I'd worked through that conundrum, the creature was only a handful of footballs away. I needed to do something, and fast, else I was going to end up in that big, hairy fucker's belly. On instinct, I was reminded of the magic bubble that had cast around us when it first appeared on this plane. That spherical shape had been obviously designed to keep the toxic atmosphere out. Could I use it to trap something coming at me as well? I never cast a masked stasis spell. The largest stasis field I'd ever pulled off was the one that was currently within its line. That was because the difficulty in casting such spells was directly proportionate to the volume of space affected. Volume was the greatest limiting factor for using time limit. The more matter you attempted to affect, the resistance, which meant that in theory, if the volume of the stasis field did not exceed my abilities, the shape of it didn't matter. The giant four-armed ape thing was almost on me. No time to think, Cullen. I exerted my will, perfectly envisioning the shape I wished the stasis field to take. Then, I released the spell. The configuration I'd settled on was a hollow dome, approximately 15 feet across and 3 inches thick. The construct itself had a rather large surface area, but a relatively small internal volume in comparison to the area it could potentially affect. So it actually wasn't all that hard to cast. Now let's see if it works. The magical effect that I call the stasis field actually wasn't, because stasis fields didn't completely halt time. Instead, the spell slowed time drastically within the affected area. So, when the giant space wheel hit the field, nearly all forward momentum halted for the parts of its body that had entered my spell's area of effect. However, the rest of its body kept moving forward. This caused a rapid and rather spectacular deceleration of the space ape's body, almost as if it had hit a brick wall. The parts of its body that had come into contact with the spell became stuck like a bug in a glue trap. Even better, the more it struggled, the greater the surface area that came into contact with the stasis field, the more the creature became entangled. In awe of my own ingenuity, I finished transforming and watched in complete and utter fascination while the creature tried to free itself. As the great beast struggled, opening its misshapen mouth wide to release silent screams of frustration, it occurred to me that the spell had a great many applications. Essentially, it worked like a force field, which was kind of like the holy grail of defensive spells. In Druidry, we manipulated physical matter, but that approach was cumbersome at best. And in standard wizardry, a spellcaster could use wards to create a force field-like effect, but it took a great deal of time to draw the glyphs and symbols necessary. It wasn't something you could do on the fly, not to mention powering them up and imbuing them with enough magic to function. Even then, your wards had to continue specifically to repel whatever you wanted to keep out, which was another limiting factor to such spellwork. Thus, effective force field creation was a magical conundrum that had baffled magicians for centuries. In fact, the problem had eventually been named after a famous theurgist who'd spent most of his life trying to solve it, Julian's Enigma. And I had just solved Julian's Enigma. So, what am I going to call my spell? Stasis Barrier? Stasis Blockade? Stasis Fence? Stasis Shield? Shield? Stasis Shield. Yeah, that works. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I created a perfect defensive spell. The only real drawback was that it required the use of time magic, so it wasn't something I could use in front of witnesses. At least, not if I didn't want to be haunted by the gods and demigods of every single pantheon in existence. Meaning, I could never let the world know that I just solved one of the greatest challenges ever known to defensive magic users. Well, still, it was one of those spells that I could always pull out of my ass if I had time. But I could worry about that another day. Right now, I needed to decide what I was going to do with my villa. Although I could breathe the planet's harsh atmosphere just fine in my room, I didn't have a lot of room to move inside my stasis field. If I wanted to get out of here, I'd need to drop the spell and fight things. I was almost ready to do just that when a dozen more of the giant gorilla things showed up to help their friend. A couple of them tried pulling their friend out of the stasis field, ripping up his arms off in the process. Then they started throwing those black shards at me with deadly precision. Based on the speed with which they were able to throw them, and the placement of said shards when they hit my stasis shield, I have no doubt that I'd play hell if I could attend. Fighting a baker's dozen of those big, hairy, Sasquatch-looking things sounded like a lot more work than I was willing to take on. After all, I'd already learned something new. Why put myself out unnecessarily? So I sat cross-legged in the dirt, I began to meditate, eyes open so I could monitor the threat in front of me. Chapter 4. Click showed up an hour or so later, appearing inside my stasis shield as if he'd known exactly where I'd be. Of course, he pretty much did, within certain limits of probability. Then again, there was also a chance that I'd be dead when he returned, and that he had found me roasting on a spit over McGill's campfire. Each time Click placed me in mortal danger for the sake of his lessons, I tried not to think about how he'd likely witnessed all the gruesome ways I might die, well in advance of such. And I ignored the fact that he had weighed the potential risks and benefits of dicing, sifting the threads of my existence like so much sand in the name of my education as a mage and a druid. Or, as he liked to put it, to transform me into a druid, most arcane. I set those thoughts aside after he appeared, else I might attempt to strangle him. And frankly, there was no way I could take the guy, the more informed or no. Meanwhile, he glanced this way and that, hands clasped behind his back like a math teacher searching for an error in his student's work. I said, gesturing to my stasis shield. You're not even going to comment on the fact that I saw Julian's innate value. Click waved my question off, replying with indifference in his voice. Ah, I solved that problem 900 years ago. Was curious if you'd do the same. Surprised you made the field so thick. Works just as well with a fraction of volume. He frowned and paid the word. Sloppy, but I suppose it'll do. Whatever. Truth be told, I was happy that I wasn't the first to solve the problem. I thought I deserved some recognition, considering that I'd only started learning time magic a few months ago. Or years, depending on how you measure such things. Guess I'm a bit miffed, lad. Did I say something to offend you? Quick asked as he made faces at McGillick in my stasis. Well, yeah. What is it with you and Morgan? This is the same way. Getting even the slightest nod of approval from the guy is like pulling teeth. I mean, by the time you saw Julie, when you had, what, a couple of millennia under your belt as a chronologist, I've been at this only a fraction of that at most. Beginner's luck, no more, he said, shrug, turning his head this way and that as he examined the villa. Meanwhile, the space apes were going, well, apeshit on the other side of the barrier. Do you think they stand on their hands to eat, or do they take turns tossing food at each other's noggins? It suddenly occurred to me that the immortal magician was acting very nonchalant considering the feat I just pulled off. I snapped my massive fingers, producing a sound not unlike a gunshot. Really, smart. You're jealous, I exclaimed. Flick stuck his thumbs in his ears, wagging his fingers as he gave the killer raspberries. Nonsense, lad, nonsense! There was a hint of irritation. The tautness I hadn't noticed before. Yeah, you're definitely upset I was able to pull off that spell. Doesn't take much effort, he replied, feigning indifference, as he mirrored the space ape's facial expressions. Quite a feat considering their anatomical differences. Just a bit of ingenuity. Was that a compliment? I asked, smiling. The magician, formerly known as Grim, moved his hands up in the air as he turned on me. Fine, you're a fucking prodigy, you little prick pudding. Is that what you wanted to hear? Took me damn near a century to learn how to cast simple stasis fields. Never mind this construct you pulled out your arse. I'm done with feckin' upstart Tootsie. Unfucking believable. I wiped the smug smile off my face, partially because I knew the hints of my smile. Well, I had an excellent teacher, I said, perfectly serious. Nick blew a stray lock of hair out of his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. Stop blowing smoke up me backside, and let's get you back to your damn tree before I blow a feckin' fuse. Ready when you are, He waved at the space apes who were beating their chests and hammering the ground outside the shield. The ones who weren't entangled, that is. All right, then drop these shields so we can get out of here. No, Dice. The state you're in, you will lead me here to fight those things. He arched an eyebrow. It's a stasis field, vibe. Magic stable as a horse's hard cock once it's cast. Whoever leading these poor beasts to suffer till they perish of old age. That is, if those other fellows don't abandon and let me starve. I thought about it, rubbing my chin absently as I examined my spell. It was time I did that, and there was no reason why I couldn't add a few leaves here and there to replace an expiration date of the spell. I worked through the necessary adjustments in my head and made a series of arcane gestures, mumbling under my breath as I modified the spell. If my calculations were correct, the shield would now dissipate in an hour or so. There, that should do it, I said, rubbing my hands together as I glanced at Click. The magician glared at my shield, tensing his shoulders and arms. His hands curled in fists, and he sputtered a few unintelligible syllables before releasing a string of Welsh curse words in a tone that could curdle me. The next thing I knew, I was back in the grove, and Click was nowhere to be found. So, same time tomorrow? I yelled, only to be answered by another string of curses that faded off in the silence. No sooner had I dozed off to sleep in my cubicle cottage than the oak sent me an urgent message that roused me awake. It was an image of three large wolves prowling the woods at night. Something dangerous was stalking around near the oak, for its sake. The oak and grove each spoke telepathically to me through our bond, using images to convey meaning and intent. At first, it had been difficult to interpret their unique method of communication, but I've learned how to decipher the messages. Time moved differently here. By now, I'd spent enough time inside the grove communicating with them to learn their moods and, to some extent, their personalities. Although the two had been created from the same magic acorn at the same time, they were two separate entities. I'd begun to see them as brother and sister, the oak, the masculine seeking, and the grove, the more feminine. Regardless of the existential nature of the pair, it was clear they were two halves of the same coin. Therefore, any attack on the oak was an attack on the grove, and vice versa. So, when the grove sent me an image of an oak tree on fire, I knew it was serious trouble. The two were quite protective of each other, likely because one could not survive without the other. Perhaps their bond went deeper than that, but I wasn't enough of a druid yet to sort out the emotional motivations of the tree. But it was obvious that something had the grove in a tizzy, and it wanted me to intervene without question. I bolted out of bed, searching for my praying skin bag, only to realize it had been strapped over my shoulder the entire time. The thing had a mind of its own, and while it wasn't as intelligent as the oak and grove, it tended to respond to my needs and relocate itself accordingly. Instinctively, I reached for my pants and boots. Then I thought better. Something tells me this is going to get up. Best I go out prepared. No need for a repeated fight with the Valkyrie. As I exited the cottage, I pulled the strap over my head, leaving the bag slung over one shoulder only so it wouldn't break when I shifted it. Based on the messages I was getting from the oak, the danger seemed to be imminent and not immediate, which meant I had time for a full-fledged transformation. Once I was in my full Fomorian form, I reached into my bag and rummaged around for a few seconds until I found what I wanted. With a heavy sigh, I pulled Pepper's greatsword back. Oh, there you are, master, the sword said in a voice that sounded very, very similar to a certain overly confident old Angel. I've been eagerly looking forward to the moment when you told me for that dark, dreary sack. Speaking of which, I never did finish telling you about the time Pepper defeated the whole squad for a day. After slaying the sword's former master, I'd snagged the massive weapon as a bit of war. It had been made for a Fomorian's hands, forged in proportions suitable for a 12-foot giant. While my massive mitts were a bit more misshapen than Pepper's had been, from the moment I grabbed the sword, it felt as though it had been tailor-made for my hide size. was a sentient object capable of speech, but with an unfortunate and peculiar quirk. For some reason, its maker had placed a chaos on it that compelled it to recite the deeds of its former owner after said person had died in battle. Little did I know that I'd triggered the first time I swung it around, outside of left in my bag and never touched the damn thing again. As for how it had learned English, the sword claimed it had been enchanted with the ability to learn its owner's language by osmosis. Why it spoke in any pan British accent was beyond me, although I suspected it had picked it up from my subconscious mind. I repeatedly asked it to drop the accent, to which the sword had repeatedly replied, "What accent, master?" Finally, I'd given up and resolved to only bring it out in emergencies. With an annoyed hiss, I cut the mid-sentence. "Another time, all right, or not. Right now, I need you to be quiet. Something is stalking and I don't want to give away my position before I know what it is." Ornum replied in a stage whisper. "Certainly, master. Mum's the word." Once I was fairly certain the sword would be quiet for the next few minutes. It had a short memory, after all. I cast millions spell on myself. Then I instructed the oak to send me earthside so I could see what the hell had been thrown at such a place. When I arrived outside, the forest was on fire. It didn't take long to determine the source, as three Eldorman fire giants were waging war on my good oak. Fucking giants. I hate giants. I had my reasons for avoiding giants, besides getting clobbered by a 12-foot tall redneck Viking pinch off the human and fake flesh. Reason number one, they were heartless, conniving, murderous, cannibalistic monsters. Every last one. To say they were nasty and cruel would be too generous, as their reputation for filling their pots with innocent humans and fae was well deserved. Not that there were innocent fae, but it was still pretty messed up that giants ate other intelligent supernatural species. Plus, fighting bastards always brought back painful memories that I'd just as soon forget. And taking on prowess Falcon was one such experience. Falcon are British giants out of Celtic folklore that have just one arm and one leg. While a person might think such a creature would be shit, that was a mistake. A single falcon fell an entire forest in a night, or so the legend said. Certainly, the one I fought would have killed me if my hindsight hadn't emerged to take care of business. Unfortunately, that victory had cost me dearly. Everything that followed after that was a complete and total shit show. Yeah, if I had to do it over again, I'd skip that night entirely. Then there was Elmo, the ogre with a heart of gold. Most people wouldn't know that ogres weren't truly related to giants, as they were almost as large and just as ugly. But size and looks notwithstanding, the guy had been nothing like the ogre. Elmo was the epitome of the term giant, and in the brief time I'd known him, I'd been proud. Sadly, he'd been the lone witness to a brutal murder, and the killer then murdered the ogre in order to cover his tracks. Eventually, I'd avenged Elmo by taking down the person who murdered him, but I still blamed myself for not preventing his death in the first place. Despite the guilt I felt over Elmo's passing, my most painful giant-related memory was the time my best friend Hemi died while fighting a giant during our trip to Underland. The bastard pulled him off the cliff, and I would have died in my arms. Even though